Hello, good evening, and a big welcome here to tonight's 5 by 15. I couldn't be more excited to be introducing the speakers we've got for you tonight. It really is one of the very best I think we've ever done. We've got an extraordinary range of subjects. We're going to be talking about endings, in particular Roger Federer's. We're going to be talking about escapes, a particular escape from Auschwitz, which went on to change the world, a startling debut novel from California, the biodiversity crisis, as well as the work of an illustrator who's shown us how we are losing so many precious words that relate to nature and the natural world. As ever, our speakers will speak for 15 minutes, but in this case, as we're online, we asked them to speak for about 12, but we won't be cutting anybody off because I promise you these stories are tremendous. There's no break, and we'll post all the details of all the books in the chat as we go along. And as ever, books are available from our bookstore, Newham Books, which again, you can find all the details, and it's great to support local bookstores like that. So sit back and enjoy yourself. Everyone at 5 by 15, we're all really honored to be hosting our speakers tonight for you. And I think it's going to be quite wonderful. Now, first up is Jonathan Freedland, no stranger to 5 by 15, and I suspect no stranger to many of you listening. He's a Guardian journalist. He's one of our foremost commentators on the political scene. I personally am an avid follower of his columns, as well as his wonderful Radio 4 series, The Long View. He writes as a novelist under the pseudonym of Sam Bourne, but he's also a brilliant non-fiction writer, as you're going to hear in a few minutes. The Escape Artist tells the story of how Rudolf Vrba escaped from Auschwitz to bring the story of what was going on in the death camps to the rest of the world. I guarantee you won't put it down. Jonathan, over to you, and thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. Thanks to everyone watching. This story begins, for me anyway, in the mid-80s when I was 19 years old. I was in a darkened cinema in, actually, the Curzon Cinema, Mayfair in London, there to see the first part of that epic 9.5-hour documentary Shoah, the film made by Claude Lanzmann. There's no archive in the film. It is just a series of interviews, and one after another, people who witnessed the attempt, or rather the murder of 6 million Jews, the attempt to destroy the Jewish people. One interviewee absolutely leapt out from the screen to me above all the others, and I never forgot his name, I never forgot his face. He was Rudolf Vrba. And while the other people on the film, in the film, looked to me old and broken, and sort of hunched almost, there was this striking man, handsome, dapper, confident. He was wearing a tan leather coat. He was in New York City. He looked a bit like a kind of Al Pacino, Scarface era Al Pacino. And he was speaking in English where a lot of the others were not. And he just leapt out. He seemed, and in some ways actually was, a generation younger than everyone else in the film. And I never forgot about him because he mentioned something amazing. Almost as an aside, he says that when he was 19, he had escaped from Auschwitz. I know, and have since nailed this down, that only 4 Jews ever escaped from Auschwitz, but Vrba and his escape companion, Fred Wetzler, they were the first. Only 4 ever did it, they were the first. Vrba did it when he himself was 19 years old. In the film, they don't really get into it, but at the time I thought this is extraordinary. And the story I found came back to me in recent years in the era of post-truth and fake news. I found myself thinking again about Vrba because not only did he escape and do it in the most extraordinary and thrilling way, he did it, as Rosie mentioned, in order to warn the world. That was his driving purpose. He wanted the truth, the facts, to be out in the world for reasons which I'll say more about. It did have great success. It saved, through a series of diplomatic moves, this escape, and the report he wrote after he'd escaped Auschwitz led to the saving of 200,000 Jewish lives. My view, and I'm going to try and argue this tonight, is that his story should be up there with Anne Frank, Oskar Schindler, Primo Levi, the stories that define the Holocaust in our imaginations and in our memories. So let's get this first image up of the man who we're talking about. Here he is. This is Rudolf Vrba. That's him after his escape. After he'd escaped, he joined the resistance and he wore the uniform of Slovakia. You can see what he looks like there. But the thing that made him famous is this place. We'll go to the next image, where he arrived there at Auschwitz on the last day of June 1942. As you'll know, people who arrived at Auschwitz were immediately separated, selected. The overwhelming majority were led, Jews were led immediately to the gas chambers, but a small minority, between 5%, 10%, of each train load of Jews that would arrive would be taken off to work as prisoners. The word I use in the book is slaves. They were slave workers. And hence the slogan, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free, or work will set you free. Vrba was a prisoner, a slave laborer, but something really unusual there, which is the average life expectancy for a Jew who arrived at Auschwitz was measured in hours, but if they were a slave worker there, really very few made it beyond a couple or perhaps 3 months. Vrba was so unusual because he was there for the best part of 2 years. And through those 2 years, he saw the most enormous amount. He had this uniquely panoramic perspective on the place. He worked all these different places around the camp, but also on the process. He saw pretty well every stage of the killing process. So his job for 10 months was to work on the platform, the railway platform known as the ramp, where each train came in, bringing disgorging from the cattle trucks another transport of Jews. He worked there for 10 months. He saw every single one come in, and then those people being selected, with this huge number being sent to the gas chambers. But he worked at all these other places, a place known as Canada, which was the sort of El Dorado of Auschwitz, where all the stolen goods of the Jews were kept. And so he saw how the Jews were arrived, selected, deprived of their worldly goods, and then sent to the gas chambers. And he almost became a kind of analyst of the process, understanding it, how it was broken down into different stages, how it was so seamlessly efficient. And two important things happened in that process. The first was that he reached this great insight, which was going to shape all the events that followed. He realized that the key to the Nazi method was deception. It was because the Nazis lied to their victims at every single stage that they were able to conduct this slaughter in an orderly and smooth way, that it was the cardinal principle. It wasn't just some add-on, that the Jews were deceived, and it happened at every stage, so that before they got on the trains, they were told they were being resettled, new homes, new villages, new communities in the East, where they would live. So they believed that, and that's partly why they got on those trains, because they believed the lie they were told. When they arrived, they were told, they were asked, what is your profession? We need to know your trade, because you'll do that afterwards, after you've been cleansed in the so-called showers. Another lie, when of course the showers were gas chambers. At every stage they were deceived. And so the great insight Rudolf Vrba, then just 17 years old, had was that the only way to break the Nazi killing machine was to break the lie, to break through this veil of lies and ignorance and come through with the truth, because he realized that it was so much easier for the Nazis to kill people who had no idea what was coming to them than if their victims did have that knowledge, they would then not go quietly. So he became determined to break the secrecy and tell the Jews of the world, the remaining Jews, what fate awaited them, so they wouldn't go quietly onto those trains. That became his driving purpose. He had the most phenomenal memory. I did toy with calling this book the memory man, because he was able to memorize every transport that came in, the estimate of the numbers, the details of the point of origin, etc. That would also become really important. But he resolved to escape. Well, let's have a look at the next image. This you're about to see is the telegram that was issued by the SS officer in charge of the security of the prison, of the camp. And here he is sending word to the Gestapo, essentially saying, we've lost 2 prisoners. It happened, you can see the dates there, Rosenberg and Wetzlar. Rudolf Vrba's name before he changed it was Walter Rosenberg. There are their 2 names in the middle. You can see the date, 7th of April, that's the day they went missing. They came up with the most ingenious method to pull off their escape. I'm going to hold it back for you because I want you to read the book. It was so ingenious. It required physical resilience. It required courage. But the main thing was they spotted a loophole a gap in the Nazi defenses. It wasn't a physical gap. It was a fatal flaw in their system. The only clue I'll give you, it was something to do with the Nazis' predictability, the way they always stuck to the same routines. Through that, they escaped, hence the telegram that was sent. They then, because they, by no means were they free at that point, they then had to cross Nazi-occupied Poland, the 2 of them, Wetzlar age 25, Vrba age 19, across marshlands, across forests, across rivers in occupied Poland, traveling at night. They couldn't dare be caught by Nazi collaborators in Poland itself. They crossed the border into their native Slovakia, and there they wrote a report. We might be able to see the front page, the cover page of the report, an English translation of it. But there they crammed in, dictated, there it is, the front page of the report, 32-page, single-space, detailed, factual account of the entire killing process. At that point, it was the most detailed account of what was happening in Auschwitz that existed. Nobody in the world even knew the word Auschwitz until that document that they had effectively smuggled out. It then went on its own journey, passed hand to hand across borders, and through really a series of miracles, it reached the Allied powers. We can see the people whose desks it crossed in this next image, because it did reach the desks of Winston Churchill on the left there, Franklin Roosevelt, the American president, and Pope Pius XII in the Vatican. They saw that report, and through a series of international moves, it led to the saving of 200,000 lives in Hungary, which was the last Jewish community, the one that the Nazis had not yet got their hands on. The Jews of Budapest were, as I describe and recount in the book, effectively saved by 19-year-old Rudolf Vrba's report with Fred Wetzlar. It's an incredible story, but it's not entirely smooth story. And in my last minute or so, the reason partly why this story appealed to me was it wasn't just a thrilling adventure of how these 2 men did this. There's also a really strong lesson for today, because their report ran into this wall of disbelief. People did not believe what they were reading. They were skeptical. Even Jewish leaders in Hungary who read it wondered if this was the product of 2 young men's feverish imagination. They couldn't necessarily believe it. And similar reactions in Washington and in Whitehall that meant there was inaction, even though there was this plea for action attached to the report, even a plea to bomb the railway tracks to Auschwitz. That plea reached London, it reached Washington, but there was no such action. And that is because, I argue, that people find it very hard to believe what they cannot bear to hear, that even the warned cannot always hear the warning. I think that has huge lessons for us in our modern world today, whether it is the climate crisis, where people cannot bear to hear the warning. We know that something terrible is happening, but almost don't want to face it. Or whether it is those stories, those hair-raising stories that have come out of Ukraine with Ukrainian relatives calling their family in Russia and saying we're being bombed, and their Russian relatives saying, I don't believe you. The lesson of Rudolf Vrba's extraordinary story that I tell in this book, The Escape Artist, is that just getting out the facts, the truth, the information is not always enough. People don't just have to hear the information, they have to believe it. And that is incredibly hard to do. And I believe it's one of the powerful lessons of this story, and one reason why I've written it and why very much I hope you read it. It is why Rudolf Vrba's experience is as urgent today as I believe it was in 1944. Thank you.
Jonathan, that was fantastic. Thank you. And you're completely right. I mean, we can't see what's happening to the Uyghurs. We don't want to know. And that was extremely chilling, putting it into that Ukrainian and Russian context, that you ring up and you say it's not happening. I hadn't thought of that, but Yeah, it's a great lesson for today, and it's a wonderfully written book. And I do actually know, because I've read that bit, how they escaped, and it's ingenious. It's extraordinary how they did it. I'm not going to give it away either. Buy the book, read it. It's so worth it. The next person on our list tonight also has written a book, which I can't recommend too highly. Leila Mottley's extraordinary debut, Nightcrawling, was begun when Leila was only 17. She is now the ripe old age of 20. And it's an astonishing book. She's as well an acclaimed youth poet, and the book has been chosen as part of Opera's book club. She has fictionalized a true story that happened in the San Francisco Bay Area some years ago, which involved a young woman who was alone and got targeted for various reasons by the police. I'm going to leave her to tell you what she wants about it, but it is a really extraordinary story about America today. And again, much as Jonathan was just saying, this is a story that in so many ways is very unbelievable, but is obviously completely true. And Leila brings it to life with power, imagination, and quite honestly, most extraordinary literary skills. So thank you very much for joining us while you're on your London tour, and we couldn't be happier to speak to you. Thank you, Leila. Over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'm Leila Mottley. I turned 20 in 2 days, and I'm a novelist. I wrote Nightcrawling when I was almost 17. I started it, and then I finished it when I was 17. And a lot of people, when they first meet me, are shocked at how young I am. And the most common question I get is, how did you do it? So here today, I am here to talk to you a little bit about how I became a writer and about young people and the arts. So I have been reading and writing since I learned how to. When I was 5, I wrote my first poem. When I was 7, I wrote my first short story. And I have always been an artist, a creative, someone who loves words and writing and language. And I think I contribute part of that to growing up around books that really reflected me, and being the daughter of a father who was also a writer. He was a playwright, and while he never made any money or anything off of his work, he loved it, and he would come home every night after his day job and he would start clacking on his computer. And I think that definitely taught me that writing and art was legitimate pursuit that could be done for passion, even if it wasn't your career. So I think that often people have ideas about what young people can do, and the ideas that we have and in our pursuits and passions that don't ever measure up to the people that I know and that I've met in my life. And I think that a huge part of that is because so many of us grow up and we get removed from our childhood and our adolescence, and we get told that we need to choose more practical pursuits, and we steer away from any art that we may have done when were younger. And I think part of the reason that I have gone into writing and pursued it so vigorously is because I was surrounded by a community, an arts community that was strong and vibrant and full of young people. So I was born and raised in Oakland, California, and that's still where I live today. And if you know anything about Oakland, it is a community that has the most thriving arts scene of any place that I've ever been. From local talents like drummer boy Aaron, who is this young Black man who goes to the corner of a park every weekend and plays his drums, to big names that have come out of Oakland and gone on to Hollywood, like Zendaya and Kehlani, both of whom went to my middle school and high school. So when I was in 6th grade, I decided I wanted to go to Oakland School for the Arts, which is a charter school within our public school system that entirely focuses on the arts and creativity. And when I went to attend Oakland School for the Arts, I started in the theater program. And I was in the theater program for 3 years, and I spent 2 hours every day doing my art, just like everyone else, even in different departments. And then after school, I would often be in rehearsals. And then in high school, I decided to switch over to the literary arts department, which was essentially a program where I got to write for 3 hours a day, every day during all of high school. And I think what's important about this is it encouraged a dedication and a practice to art from such a young age that I think a lot of us don't get, particularly in high school, when many of us are told it's time to start looking towards career or more practical pursuits. But what I found out and what I learned through going to my high school and being in the arts scene in Oakland was that there were thousands of other young people who were just as talented, if not more so, who had these huge ideas and big dreams, and who were dedicated enough and persistent enough to chase them. And I think that there's an idea among so many of us that young people are lazy and don't have as much going on as we do. And I think it's important that we put in context why young people grow up and leave the arts, because that kind of teaching, that kind of socialization to think that we aren't special and that we are not going to be able to achieve our dreams is the reason that so many of us give up on things that we love. So when I was in high school, I wrote my first novel at the age of 14. And that was because we were encouraged in my arts program to try NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month. And National Novel Writing Month is exactly what it sounds like, where you write a novel in 1 month. And some of us did it and some of us didn't. And that was my introduction to novel writing. And then I wrote my next novel on my own time at 15. And then I wrote my third novel, NIGHTCRAWLING, at a month before I turned 17. I started writing it, and I knew that I wanted to tell the story of young Black girls in Oakland who are vulnerable and whole people and who get to have narrative control where we often don't. And I think what was so important was that I was 17 at the time, and I was able to really write from a 17-year-old's perspective without the judgment and distancing that happens when we're removed from adolescence. And so I wrote this book, and when I started writing it, I was also the Oakland Youth Poet Laureate. So when I was 16, I became the Oakland Youth Poet Laureate. And that essentially meant that I traveled around the Bay Area performing poetry and running writing workshops. And what I learned from this was that no matter what school I was going into, no matter what group of kids or what background they were from, they all had immense talent and ideas that no one had ever asked them to share. And I think it's really important that as people, especially as adults, that we look to young people and acknowledge that they have more happening inside their heads than we might often validate or even give space to. So I ran a series of workshops called Growing Up Oakland that essentially gave time and space for young people to document and archive what it meant to be growing up in Oakland at the time. And I think from that, a lot of young people were given the space in which they could speak to their experiences without judgment or shame and through art. And I think that is one of the most essential things that a young person can do, is give themselves full credit for their experience in the moment. So my novel NIGHTCRAWLING features several young people who are artists or have these passions. And it was important for me to showcase how young people find joy and express creativity through arts and hobbies. And so Kiara, the main character, she is a painter and a muralist, and she does graffiti. And through all of these things, she's able to achieve a lightness and a joy and a delight that she really isn't able to access in other parts of her life. Her brother Marcus is a rapper, and while he's not very good at it, it does provide him an ability to pursue something that gives him hope for his future and faith that he has more than what the world might expect or want from him. And then Chiara's friend Ale and neighbor Trevor. Ale is a skateboarder and Trevor plays basketball. And I think these kind of physical releases and hobbies are also akin to art, because they focus first on how we feel and on expression and on allowing us the freedom to put our joy and our experiences first. And I think as adults, we often give up on our passions or our hobbies because they don't necessarily do something practical for us. But one of the most important things in being alive is being able to find hope and to find joy. So I am going to read you a short passage from Nightcrawling about art. When I paint, I close my eyes. Marcus and Ale both laugh when I do this. They think you gotta see to paint, but sight is just a distraction from what it really takes to translate image to art. I let it flow out my fingers, escape out my breath, and I don't need to see when my body is an entire vision. I've been tagging since I was 13. Back then, I wouldn't have even called it tagging because I just had some Sharpies and a will to have my name on every block. Then, Ale bought me a can of blue spray paint for my 14th birthday, and I spent a month going wild with it before I shook it one day and it was empty. It became a tradition, a new color for every birthday since. Marcus was the one who took me on bike rides and told me that there really ain't no difference between the murals and swirling tags we'd pass. That art is the way we imprint ourselves onto the world, so there is no way to erase us. He says that's what his lyrics are for. And I think Chiara says it best, this sentiment that art is the way that we imprint ourselves on this world. And I think it's incredibly important and essential to give young people access to the arts because it is a powerful tool for transformation and allows us to express the particular truths of childhood and adolescence that we often leave behind. Thank you.
Leila, thank you so much. That was wonderful. It makes me now really understand why your book is so incredibly powerful and incredibly good, because other writers who attempt to inhabit a 17-year-old, as indeed Chiara is in the book, and just about to come up to 18, and it's so vivid and so real and such an extraordinary story, and all your other characters. And yes, I love the way that you have Trevor with his hoops, and that is a similar kind of way of expressing your life and your desires. So please read the book, and I wish you good luck with it and good luck with your book tour in England. And thank you very much for joining us. Now, our next speaker joins us from Kew, as indeed you can see behind him. Professor Alex Antonelli is the scientific director of Kew, and he's written a terrific new book called The Hidden Universe, which I loved. I love all those kind of books. Alex is absolutely one of the best, in which he argues incredibly passionately about why we have to not just understand what biodiversity is, but understand how incredibly important it is to all of us. It is the most important tool that we have in our toolbox to help combat climate change. Alexandre comes from Brazil. He's been passionate about this all his life. He knows everything you can think of that there is to know. And he's also one of the masterminds behind the Millennium Seed Bank at Wakehurst, which when you get there, describes itself as the most biodiverse place on the earth, which indeed it is. Thank you, Alexandre, for joining us, and I hand over to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Rosie. It was so fascinating to listen to Leila and Jonathan. So I'm going to shift gears quite a lot here, although I think nature also has a lot of poetry. So It was on Christmas Eve of 1968 that the world got a present that would completely change the way we look at our planet. It was this photo here, you can see in front of you. It was nicknamed the Earthrise, and it's been described as one of the most influential environmental photographs ever taken. And we used to think that our planet was this huge, almost endless planet, until we realized that it's just actually this tiny bluish dot floating around our sun, just one star among billions of trillions of other stars. And as we later discovered, also equally, even higher perhaps number of planets floating around. And it's really on this very thin skin that surrounds this little Christmas bubble that we hold everything that is dear to us. Life, and plenty of life, from the colorful clownfish of Australia's coral reefs to the mega mammals of Africa's savannas, down to Boris Johnson's gut bacteria. But nowhere else on Earth are there so many species as in the tropical rainforests. And I'm lucky enough to have been born not far from one in Brazil's Atlantic forest. And it was there that one of my very first memories played out. I was only about 5 years old when I saw a beautiful blue morpho butterfly. It was huge, or perhaps I was very tiny, but it flew quickly towards me and then it turned right and disappeared. And I was totally paralyzed. How could something so insanely beautiful exist? And just like a duckling prints on the first animal they see when they are born, so did I fall in love with the nature of my home country, Brazil. So while all the other kids were playing football on the beach and surfing and having fun, I went all by myself, filling my pockets with everything I would find in the forest. Delicate flowers, shells, beetles, seeds. That wasn't a good combination to have in your pocket, but luckily most of the beetles, well, at least some, managed to escape before I got home. I was very happy, and I thought the forest was endless and everlasting, but it wasn't. So today, less than 8% of Brazil's Atlantic forest remains, and most of it in small pockets scattered all over a bare landscape of pasture, farming, and concrete. I took this photo, you can see here, just a few months ago, outside Rio de Janeiro. And the guy was pouring gasoline on the rest of the trees he had felled and setting fire on them. So my heart was really bleeding. And satellite images show that deforestation rates in the region increased by 125% last year. And this isn't unique to Brazil's Atlantic forest. Since 1950, we've lost a quarter of the world's tropical rainforests. So we don't have to be Einstein to figure out that this is no good news for the species that live in those habitats. So scientists like myself and my colleagues here at Kew, we are estimating that 2 in 5 plant species, so about 140,000 plants, are now threatened to go extinct over the next decades. And the situation is just as bad for animals, I'm afraid. And in total, we are reckoning that about 1 million species now face extinction because of us. And these problems aren't just in the tropics. The UK has lost almost half of its biodiversity as a result of land change since the Industrial Revolution. And I'm very sorry to bring you this news on a Monday evening, but I'm sure you kind of knew this already. So perhaps the bigger question is, why does this really matter? There are lots of problems out there. We've spent a couple of years obsessed with COVID, and we're now beginning to see what's coming out of that in terms of the rise of living costs, inflation. But in the long term, climate change will be an even bigger issue, which is already being started to felt by each one of us, and some people more than others. And I'm sorry to say that climate change is not the biggest tsunami underway. It is the loss of nature and its associated biodiversity. If we drastically reduce emissions and draw down carbon out of the atmosphere, we can mitigate climate change and hopefully reach a more stable climate. But a species that goes extinct never comes back. And with it goes all the stuff that species give us all the time for free: food, medicine, building materials, fibers, beauty, and so much more. If you just stop and try to think for a moment, how many species have you used today? For breakfast, your lunch, in your clothes, in the furniture around you? Probably very many. But is biodiversity the same thing as species? Not really. It's actually much more than that. So in my book, I use examples from my scientific expeditions around the world to explain that biodiversity is a star. Just like climate is more than just temperature. It's also rainfall, it's the seasons, extreme weathers, and so forth. And biodiversity is the variety of all life, from the genes all the way through to species, the evolutionary history that species represent, the ecological functions in nature, and the many ecosystems that make this such a beautiful and amazing planet, from the Scottish Highlands to the rainforests of Borneo. And another cool thing about biodiversity is that it's not really what most people think it is. I have no idea what you think when I say the word biodiversity, what comes to your mind. But the odds are that you may imagine some nice birds perhaps, or mammals, or pretty flowers in front of you. But most species on the planet are really, really small. And some people would say that they're very, very ugly as well. But of course, they're totally wrong on that. And you can see this in this image where different groups of species are drawn in proportion to the number of species they represent. So the beetle here on the top, that's huge because there are millions of insects. And the same with mites. And the big mammals from the savannah that you perhaps thought about when I said the word biodiversity, they're represented by just that tiny little elephant in the shade of a mushroom. Now, you could think that just because we've got people like Darwin and Linnaeus and places filled with all sorts of interesting species like the Natural History Museum or Kew, that we would already know how many species there are on Earth. But we know as little about how many species we share our planet with as we do about how many stars there are in the outer universe. This is why biodiversity is our hidden universe on planet Earth. I'll give you an example. A few years ago, my PhD student Camila, she traveled around all across the Amazon taking small samples of soil. So when she came back to my lab, we worked together with her to extract all the DNA in those soil samples to count how many species we could detect in each one of those. So try to guess how many species we could find in the equivalent of a single teaspoon of soil. 10, 50, 100? We couldn't believe when we found that 1,800 species were represented in a single sample in the Amazon, which is almost as many species of plants that we have in the whole of the United Kingdom. And most of those species were unknown to science, including most of the 400 different species of fungi that was contained in a single spoon. So the mushroom in this image here could actually be much, much larger than it's shown. But of course, we'll never be able to identify and study all those species if they go extinct. And this is why we must bend the curve on biodiversity loss. So how do we do that? In this way. And this is the most important image in my talk today and in my book as well, because it's how we're going to fix the problem. And it represents a great amount of science underneath as well. So the black curve here shows how much biodiversity we're losing. So to stop that, the first thing we've got to do is to conserve what we have left and to restore what we've degraded. We then must tackle climate change, which contributes to the threat of many species. We need to reduce other drivers like pollution and spread of invasive species and diseases. And to really turn this curve upwards, we need companies to make more sustainable products, and each of us also needs to consume less. Everyone and every part of our societies, from the governments to our schools, you and I, we need to be part of this. And the good news is that we can make a difference, a real difference, and we can see positive results almost immediately. I've packed the book with lots of tips and tricks that I hope you'll find very useful in your daily life. And we're all different. So I think we need to think how each one of us can best contribute. So for instance, my wife and I, we worked really hard to increase the biodiversity in our own garden in Sweden, which is quite tiny actually. But to the extent that the largest garden magazine in the country came to photograph it, which was quite a thing. And in the title of the news, for those of you who are not yet fluent in Swedish, they quote me saying, "Think more about biodiversity and less about your neighbors." And I never really understood why our neighbors stopped talking to us after that. We also decided to put nearly all of our family savings to buy a patch of rainforest in Brazil for permanent protection and to support the studies of scientists and young people. We were left with only £200 in our account after that, but we're happy to have done it. And all the money that I get from the sales of this book is also going into the same purpose. So even though the threats to biodiversity are so big, I am actually optimistic. And science tells us that there is still a narrow window of opportunity left for us to make peace with nature. So I hope that this book will give you new insights into biodiversity, including lots of things you probably had no idea about, I can promise you, and that you'll then want to join us in helping to protect life on this little blue planet floating around in the universe. Thank you.
Alex, thank you so much for that. That was just great. And Alex is absolutely right. The book is packed with fantastically good information. And even though there's some really despairing parts of it, you come out of it thinking, yes, we can do this. We are perfectly able to understand and make these connections and understand why it's so important to cut down, consume less. That was a fantastic graph, that last one, where you put climate change actually fairly low on the agenda. So I'm going to have to study that. Anyway, thank you so much for being with us, and thank you very much for all your work. And in fact, you segue very neatly into our next speaker, who's the wonderful Jackie Morris, who was the co-author and illustrator of the brilliant award-winning book called Lost Words with Robert Macfarlane, where Jackie and Robert looked at the way we have lost words for nature in all the words that we teach children, particularly. So things that were very common before have now slipped out, and about why that really, really matters. It's in fact, you're doing the literary equivalent of what Alex has just told us from a more scientific point of view. Jackie's got a new book called Feather, Leaf, Bark and Stone, which is a bit like what it says on the tin as such, in that she has typed her poems and her words and her inspirations onto gold leaf and then photographed it. Some are typed onto feathers, some have been put onto leaves and to bark, and indeed some of them have come through stone. This is brought to you by Unbound Publishers, and we're thrilled to have Jackie with us to tell us about it and show us some of the samples from the book, which is out this month, I think. So thank you, Jackie. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. I have to first say how much I've enjoyed listening to the other speakers, and I want to try and thread what I say through what they have spoken about. I'm 60 years old now, and I've spent my life trying to be an artist, wanting to be an artist, dreaming. And this dream began when I was 6 years old, and I saw my father drawing. I didn't know what the word for artist was, but I just knew that I wanted to be able to make a bird appear on a piece of paper in the way that I saw him do. I also had a real passion for his typewriter, which my mum had bought him as a present for it was either their second or their third wedding anniversary. And he was a policeman. He was a policeman who loved to draw. My family, his parents thought that reading was a very lazy thing to do, that drawing was something that other people did. So it was a strange family to grow up in, where he kind of hid his drawings, but they were beautiful and I loved them. So I had to follow my dream. I think I knew in the same way that Leila knows, you just have to, if you wish to create, you have to create. If you don't, then you become ill. It's not, it's almost like it chooses you rather than you choosing to do it. And I'm learning as I get older that my art is my spiritual way of being. It's a form of prayer, it's a form of ritual, and it is also a form of protest for me. It's my voice. A long time ago, in between illustrating, I started to paint the Labyrinth Pattern onto stones. So I would go to a place, a pebble beach, I would choose a stone, walking along, looking at each pebble, realizing how different each one was, how it is shaped by the sea, by time, trying to understand the making of it. And I would paint this labyrinth shape onto it. It's not my design, it's a design that is as old as time, looks like a fingerprint, feels like a pathway, feels very much to me like a prayer. And then I would take this back and I would put it back on the beach, walk away and leave it. What I was left with was these remnants, because I use transfer leaf. So it's almost like having the spiritual pattern, the soul of the stone. And I did start by using scraps of gold leaf, but I soon rather loved these remnants that I was left with and was trying to find a way of using them. So I carry on doing illustrating books. I think in my 30s, I started writing as well. Never thought that I could be a writer because I couldn't spell. And but I always loved story. And life was wrapped around doing art every day. I have to make marks on paper every day, otherwise my head doesn't feel right. And I doodle when people are talking, which sometimes irritates people. 2 years ago, I can't even remember how long ago, 2 years, my dad became ill and then he died, and my life was shaken. You know, everybody knows this is going to happen. There is a blessing which goes, your father dies, you die, your child dies. That's the order things should be in. My dad died just before lockdown, so his funeral became less of a celebration of his life and more of a quiet sense of loss. Lockdown was a protection in a way from all the events and things that you're expected to do as an artist. And I couldn't paint. I didn't know how to do it. And painting, like I say, it's like breathing for me. It was hard to catch a breath. And I turned to his typewriter and I started typing on the remnants of these soul stones, small pieces of writing, gathering my thoughts and breathing my way through extreme pain in order to navigate my way through life, which again, art is navigation. But then I also became quite obsessed with typewriters and started collecting them. And the image that you saw before was the very aptly known Smith Corona folding typewriter. This is my latest purchase, which is a German typewriter. And around it is the clutter which I work with. The inside of my head looks a bit like this, I think, with kind of chaos, and the art is a way of making order out of the chaos. I love to be by the sea. I love the idea of leaving these stones where people will find them. And sometimes I take them down to the beach knowing that there will be nobody who picks them up and they will be returned to the sea, which is right. Other times I know that they'll find their way. I hope to do this with my book as well and just leave it on the beach, maybe for somebody to find if they want to. I hope I have more life to spend doing this. I hope that I can continue both to write and to paint. The Lost Words has been an amazing creature in my life, in that it has, in more ways than ever before, allowed me to use my voice for protest. And I think this is what Leila is saying also. You know, if writing is about finding a voice, your voice also needs an audience. I learned so much from the audience for my books that it just astonishes me. And my art is kind of about curiosity as well. So what happens when you type onto a feather, and how can you do it? Surfaces are beautiful. I love typing on leaves. The book is, it's a kind of book about, as I say, navigating through grief. One of the griefs at the moment that I have is an ash tree in my garden, which is ceasing to thrive, as many ash trees are. And she holds her death, if indeed she is dying. So physically, so visually. If I can read you one small passage from the book, it says, "Her leaves give music to the wind, shade in summer, shelter to small lives, bird, insect, bat. On her bark skin hollows, scars give testament to storms weathered, long life. Her branches pleat and plait to reach the light, and at her feet her scattered children thrive." So that's kind of an epitaph to my ash tree, who is still alive at the moment. I hope to continue working in this way. I feel with Featherleaf, it was such a strange book to do, because I had all these fragments which were written on gold leaf, and we weren't actually sure how on earth to make them live as a book. And the only way that I found to do this was to take them out into the light, into the garden, and photograph each piece one at a time in natural light, handheld over time. Took about 3 hours. I was listening all the time to the sounds around me. So the light where I had found each piece of writing was incorporated into the making of the image. And it's a strange thing, because in a way, the words in this book become image. So there are no paintings, and yet everything in there is an image. Typing on gold, typing on leaves, typing on feathers, holding the wild in my heart in ways that I just needed to, in order to get from day to day in my life, and catching small pieces of story. So this one, which is written on birch bark, was a true incident that happened a long time ago in a place called Dulverton, where something appeared to me in a wood, and I wrote it down on this birch bark, which I guess will, like everything else, deteriorate, but it's held through light and time in this image, which is in the book. I'm landlocked at the moment. I'm far from home, far from the sea. I love the light that is found by the sea. I love walking. I love the stones. I love the air that I breathe there. I love the diversity of life that I find every day in the shape of birds, especially in the song of birds, which is a language which I'm trying very hard to learn, to listen to properly, rather than just letting it skim across my ears. It seems more important now to listen to the voices that are other than human, to learn from the creatures that are other than human, to understand the wisdom of trees, to try and understand the wisdom of all creatures who aren't human. And in the way that I spend my time creating art, it's a realization that time is more important than money. And I think money is one of the greatest evils in our lives at the moment, because it seems that those who make our laws value money above everything else, when what actually is the most important, most valuable thing is life. And I think I will just end there if I can.
Well, of course you can, but we could have listened to you for a lot longer. Thank you so much, Jackie. That was really wonderful, and it gave a whole different dimension to what Alex had been talking about, and it was lovely to see those images, and I really look forward to the book when it comes out next month. Thank you very much for joining us. Our final speaker tonight is no stranger to 5x15, and I suspect no stranger to any of you. Geoff Dyer was described by Zadie Smith as a national treasure, something that I would absolutely agree with. I have no idea what Geoff thinks of that, that particular accolade from Zadie. He's the author of 10 non-fiction books, 4 novels, including Out of Sheer Rage and Yoga for People Who Can't Be Bothered to Do It. He's currently writer in residence at the University of Southern California, and his new book is called In the Last Days of Roger Federer, where Geoff looks at the endings of various people's careers, from artists, musicians to J.W. Turner and Bob Dylan, and of course, Federer himself. So Geoff, thank you very much for being our ending tonight, although I mean, absolutely no, it's not your ending, nor is it 5x15's ending. Anyway, over to you, and great to see you, and thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you, Rosie. You know, I'm so slow-witted that when they said I was going to go last in this program tonight, it didn't occur to me it's because of the book's title, The Last Days of Roger Federer, but that is rather appropriate. So as some of you might have heard, this book has got very little in it about Roger Federer. So I'm sorry to disappoint tennis fans. We'll make a real effort to bring it back to tennis at the end. But I thought really I'd talk tonight about one of the main characters in the book, that is to say, Friedrich Nietzsche. And also, I want to make a great claim on behalf of Turin, one of the most beautiful cities, beautiful and underrated cities, if not just in Italy, perhaps in Europe. And Nietzsche arrived there in Turin in April 1888. He was 44, and the weather was bad, but then it improved to the extent that by October of that year, he thought it was the most beautiful light he'd ever encountered, a real miracle of beauty and light, he said. And there was this blazing light of unending prospects in the darkening twilight, the shortening days of his sanity. Turin was the final stop on a journey that had led this respectable, rather priggish professor to abandon his academic job as a philologist, to become a kind of wanderer and vagabond. The highlight, without question, the happiest period of his life came early on, when he was enthusiastically admitted to the circle of Richard Wagner, because they felt, Wagner's circle felt, that he could provide some kind of philosophical underpinning for the composer's vast ambitions. Then, of course, came the fallout for multiple reasons, gathering mutual doubts about the value of each other's work, Nietzsche's hatred of Wagner's increasingly virulent anti-Semitism, and the most terrible of all things from Nietzsche's point of view, somehow he got wind of Wagner's idea that his poor eyesight was the result of compulsive masturbation. It was a devastating thing for Nietzsche. But I should add that his trouble with his eyes was just one of his physical problems. He was plagued by headaches, and his years of wandering were marked by extreme loneliness. Also, as he published book after book, he achieved a quite stunning lack of success. He had no audience at all. He was horribly conscious of the discrepancy between the value he put on his work. He said that Also sprach Zarathustra was the greatest gift ever given to mankind. He was conscious of the disparity between that and the sense of it, the almost complete lack of sense of it registered by the rest of the world. Now, as we've heard tonight, I mean, a writer of any stripe needs to retain a degree of confidence in order to keep working. But you worry also that given the value gap, you might be a megalomaniac or a lunatic. And in Nietzsche's case, the solution was to inflate still further his notion of the unprecedented importance of his books in order to explain their lack of appeal. Indifference to his work, in other words, was another symptom of how pathological the need for it had become. It was a sane strategy that seemed a further manifestation of insanity. And all of this came to a head in Turin as he conceived grander and grander plans for a series of books. At one time, he had a title, The Revaluation of All Values, quite an ambitious scheme. But then he abandoned these in favor of shorter bulletins and dispatches, Twilight of the Idols, The Antichrist, and a sort of autobiography, Ecce Homo, with its wonderful chapter titles, Why I Am So Clever, Why I Write Such Excellent Books, and then the final one, Why I Am a Destiny. So he was flickering at this point, between insights of genius and a demented sense of frustrated greatness, which often manifested itself in really quite small and pitiful ways. He became convinced, for example, that the shopkeepers saved their best grapes for him. And then one morning in January 1889, he came out onto the square where his apartment was and saw a taxi driver beating his horse and famously or mythically flew through his arms around the neck of this old nag and then collapsed, never regained his sanity. He never recovered. He lived on, though, until 1900, cared for at first by his mother and then preserved as a helpless effigy by his sister Elizabeth. He said about immortality that one must die several times while still alive, but I think his case raises the rather awful possibility that one's posthumous life can begin while you're still alive. Elizabeth, his sister, assumed not just control of her brother's helpless body, but tragically of his body of work, overseeing the transformation of a writer who had written, and I quote, of the accursed anti-Semitism that had been the reason for a radical break between me and my sister. She managed to transform this into Nietzsche's reputation so that he became someone indelibly associated with Hitler and the rise of Nazism. Nietzsche had said earlier that the prospect of meeting his sister again was the most abhorrent aspect of the eternal recurrence. Now, this is Nietzsche's key idea, the eternal recurrence, the idea being that you will live your life over and over again, every moment of it throughout all eternity. And it's a strange idea, but paradoxically, I think if you give yourself to this notion, then what it does, it really insists that there is only this one life. There is no escape from it. It was, he thought, the ultimate philosophy of affirmation, which is extraordinary when you consider how utterly threadbare his own life was. Since the eternal recurrence insists that every moment is endlessly relived, Nietzsche's final phase of euphoria, that mix of delusion and lucidity, it will fade in an instant and be followed by the decade spent as a drooling zombie, and then by his boyhood, by the long days and nights of terrible loneliness, the constant illnesses and headaches, the renewed hopes always followed by fresh disappointments, and the gradually increasing sense of having been catastrophically overlooked. The only thing not included in this endless carousel would be confirmation of his eventual posthumous global fame and influence, the satisfaction of knowing that everything he predicted for himself, even in his most delusional moments, came to pass. And the gain, well, I guess the gain would be that he'd be spared all knowledge of the moment on the 2nd of November 1933, when Hitler made a ceremonial visit to the archive where Elizabeth presented him with her brother's walking stick. The first time he mentions the eternal return is in The Gay Science. It's a famous passage, which I'll read to you now. What if some day or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life, as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? It's worth mentioning at this point Nietzsche's idea of the Ubermensch, the overman, another very widely misunderstood idea. Nietzsche's idea of the overman or the Ubermensch is someone who has succeeded in overcoming themselves and has come to terms with this idea of your life being lived over and over again. Now, I have this memory many years ago watching Wimbledon when Boris Becker, past his best, was having trouble in a match. And I remember him shouting in this kind of Teutonic rage, Uber, Uber. And he wasn't prophetically anticipating that weird loop that you can get in when you've ordered a car and it's 5 minutes away, but then a minute goes by and it's still 5 minutes away. And then weirdly, it suddenly becomes 6 or 7 minutes away. Sort of weird sort of version of the loop of time. Nor was he saying sort of Deutschland über alles. All he really meant was get the ball over the net. But I don't know. It seems to me there's a sort of connection that word Uber enables us to make between Boris Becker and Nietzsche, because remember, Nietzsche says, you know, if somebody said you've got to live this life over and over again, wouldn't it be terrible? So yeah, you think of Boris Becker tonight. I mean, I don't know whether he has access to the internet, in which case, you know, there he is in jail. He can listen to us. That would be a highlight. But otherwise, I mean, this is a phase of his life that he doesn't want to relive over and over again. You know, it's pretty terrible what's happened to him. And he's sort of younger than me. It's, you know, tough. You know, he's leading a terrible life tonight. But remember that other moment from that passage of Nietzsche's that I read when he says, have you ever known a moment in your life when you might say to the demon who said you've got to live your life over and over again, every moment of it? Have you ever known a moment when you would say, you're a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? So think of Boris Becker as a teenager winning Wimbledon. Think of him winning Wimbledon 3 times, you know, by his early 20s. And these are moments of such greatness, such wonderful moments that I doubt if anyone listening tonight has ever experienced a moment like that. Or think of somebody who conceivably achieved an even greater degree of sort of specialness. Think of Diego Maradona almost winning the World Cup single-handedly. And, you know, those moments are so great that they can validate an entire life. It's just tough if you're an athlete, because then you have to spend, I don't know, maybe 40, 50 years living in the wake of your legend. I'll just say a final thing about the eternal recurrence. You can't pick and mix. You can't just take the good bits. You have to accept the bad bits too. And, you know, we all remember that moment when Roger squandered 2 match points against Djokovic a couple of Wimbledons ago. But in order to have done things differently on those points, he'd have had to have done everything differently in the many Grand Slam titles that he did win. And I guess there's a final thing I'd mention, trying to establish this connection between tennis and Nietzsche, when it's this. I mean, there are so many lovely traditions at Wimbledon, but there are a couple that I'll mention that are particularly lovely. At Wimbledon, always, as many of you know, the first match on centre court always features the winner of the last singles match from the previous year, that is to say, the defending men's champion. And in addition, the two electronic scoreboards on centre court continue to show the results of the previous singles winners, men and women, until very shortly from the previous year, until very shortly before the start of the following year's tournament. So like this, it seems as if there is no tennis or time outside the tournament. There's nothing but an endless loop of Wimbledon fortnights. And what happened actually is that COVID broke the loop so that both scoreboards stuck in 2019. They remained showing the victors there until 2021. So 2020 ceased to exist. And they were just left sort of displaying these results like, I don't know, like the last syllable of recorded time, let's say. And that's it from me. Thank you for listening.
Geoff, thank you very much. I didn't know that about Wimbledon, that they left the score up. How weird. So they kind of had an extra year of being in an eternal loop that you might want to follow. Well, I think we could all follow you through many eternal loops, and thank all our listeners for following 5 by 15 through many loops. Thank you all to all of our fantastic speakers tonight, to Jonathan, to Leila, to Jackie, to Alexandre and Jonathan. And do join us again. We're coming back again this week, in fact, on Wednesday, when we'll be joined by George Monbiot talking about his new amazing book, Regenesis, which is all about how we can completely, radically change the food system, obviously a hot topic this week. And Franny Armstrong will be launching her new film, which is about George and about the farming system. So do join us then, usual time, usual place, and see you then, and have a very good rest of the evening. And thank you again to all our fantastic speakers. Good night.